All right, well, I am back in the garden after several days of being out of town. Unfortunately, those few days that we were gone happened to be triple-degree heat days. And that got me to thinking on the trip home, we still haven't tackled the biggest challenge that most suburban gardeners face, and that's watering. Whether you're away from home often for work, or you just work long days at the office, during the dog days of summers, it doesn't take long for your beds to dry out. So consistent watering is the biggest barrier to a successful crop. Well, as much as I hate to do it, let's get in here and assess the damage. You can see this zucchini plant clearly is a little bit worse for wear. Some of those leaves are dried out and dying. Likewise, the pepper plants along the front of this bed, you can see some leaves have dropped. There's a good many yellowing leaves as well. And then in the back, you can see that my tomato plants have also suffered. If I check this soil, I can see that it's very, very dry. That's not what we want. I'm gonna dig down a few inches. Again, still dry a few inches down. These plants aren't getting enough water. If we get a good look here, you'll see what I did. Unfortunately, this season I had a lot of trouble. Well, who knows, maybe supply chain issues like everything else on the planet. But I had a lot of trouble sourcing just my regular vinyl tubing that I use to create individual drippers for each of these individual plants. So what I did was buy this vinyl line that already has water emitters inside of it. These emitters have less flow than the drippers that I typically put on my garden. So what I did is I wrapped several of the emitter eyes around each plant, and I was optimistic that that would get enough moisture to each. But if you'll look here at these tomato plants in the middle, where most of the yellowing is on this Amana orange, I've only got a few emitter eyes along the base here, and it just doesn't seem to be enough. So what we're going to do on today's video is redo the drip irrigation in this bed. Now you might ask me why I haven't mulched these beds to conserve some water, and that's a good question. The honest answer is I wanted to do this drip irrigation video and I'm a little bit behind. All right, well, let's head inside and take a look at the tools and the materials and the fittings that we're going to need to build this system. You could spend the better part of your life becoming a deep expert on drip irrigation, but we're going to spare you the intricacies and go straight into a very simple design. Well, it all begins here with this poly tubing. This is the star of the show. It's what transports water from the faucet to our raised beds and into our raised beds. You can see here, you can pick it up at any garden center. It's just poly tubing. They come in pretty standard sizes, so I wouldn't worry too much about that. You're only going to need really one tool for the job here. This is a poly tube cutter. All they do is allow you to quickly lay your poly tube into this groove so that it's held flush. You can see the cutter here, and then cut it to length accordingly, very quickly, very easily. It'll save you a lot of time and trouble. As always, the right tool for the job makes all the difference. All right, and with that cutter, you can cut this poly tube to length, and we can use a series of fittings to modify the shape we want it to go into our bed. So we're going to discuss that right now. Again, very straightforward, so I don't want to take up a whole lot of your time on it. I want you to get out there and going. But I do want to discuss these fittings, primarily because too oftentimes you go out to the garden center and they don't have all of the fittings. And if they don't have the fittings on display, then it's natural that you might not even realize they exist. So let's discuss really the basics of what you need to know here. And then if you don't find these fittings at your local garden center, well, then it may be that they're out of stock, or you may have to look online for them if you need them in your particular design. First up is this pressure regulator. This simple apparatus threads onto our timer, which we'll talk about out in the yard in a moment, and it reduces the water pressure from your faucet to 25 psi. Which is the right pressure for operating a drip irrigation system under most circumstances. All right, now next up is a simple apparatus, but a useful one. This is a drip filter. Now, what we do is we connect this in line behind our pressure regulator. And you can see that it tees off here for us to connect our poly line that's going to run to the drip system. And down here is a filter. Let me just screw this cap off so that you can see. But this filter is intended to reduce the amount of minerals and sediment from our water supply such that they don't clog up the emitters of our drip line during prolonged use. If I look at my main poly line here as an example, we just need this one fitting, which will connect to any standard threaded faucet and adapt it to my poly. These fittings are pretty straightforward. You really just pressure fit them on, and then you have this collar that you will tighten, and that will cinch up on the poly to tighten it even further and make it absolutely watertight. Next up, T-fitting. Poly line comes in one, and you can split it in two separate directions. Extremely useful. This is the inline valve that we're going to put in our design. The main water line comes in here, comes out here, and this very simple dial gives us the ability to turn it on or off by twisting this handle. That gives us more granular control over each of our beds. I can cut the water off completely in one bed if I don't have a planting there for a particular season. A coupling. If for some reason you need to join two pieces of poly together, this is how you do it. An elbow. Clearly in a square or rectangular bed, you may have the need to bend that poly line at a 90-degree angle. Just like we're going to do in our design, this is how you do it, with an elbow. This is an end cap. Now there are several ways to pinch off poly line, but at the end of your system, unless it's a complete closed system, then you're going to need some way to ensure that the water doesn't come out the end of the poly. You can do that with one of these end caps. It locks onto the poly here, and this screws on and off to either adapt it again or to just close off the system and make sure that the water pressure is retained inside. Couple of useful little hardware that you might want to look into as well. This is a poly stake. You want to make sure that that poly stays exactly where you want it in the bed. This is simple enough. It's exactly the right size to slide on. And you'll stake that down in the ground to make sure that your poly tubing stays precisely where you want it to be. And last but not least, these pipe brackets you can get at the hardware store. Again, these are useful just to hold your poly tube down, let's say along the back of a raised bed or the edge of a bed, anything that you might want to mount that tubing to. Well, that's all well and good. Now we know how to take our poly tubing and make the transport system for the water into our raised beds. But I guess now we need to get the water out of that poly tubing and into the soil, don't we? So we're going to discuss a few methods by which we can do that. And in order to do that, I'm just going to take this poly and we're going to do a little example. Again, taking my handy poly cutter tools right here, boom. Now I'm going to introduce you to the only other tool that we're going to need in today's project, and that's this. It is a very simple hole punch. It is made such that these guides here fit right along the edges of the poly tube, and this sharp punch in the middle allows us to go right in at the exact size needed for fittings that we're going to discuss in a moment. So you can see here, I just line it up on the tube, in between those guides, and press it in. You hear that gratifying, yep, that is the punch going through the poly and leaving the perfectly sized hole for us to put these fittings in. One thing we could do is go directly in to the poly line itself with the dripper, and we're going to do a lot of that. If you can see these fittings here, they come with a barb on one side that slides nicely into the hole that we've just punched, and then a emitter on the other side, such that all of that good water can seep out of the poly tube and into the soil. Then we just take that, pop it right into the hole that we just made, and you've got your first dripper. But there are other methods as well. Sometimes you might have a plant that's off of this poly line that you want to run water to specifically, or possibly a planter, possibly that zucchini in the corner of my bed that doesn't get enough water. And for that, you have another mechanism that I'd like to show you. And that's this 1/4 inch vinyl tubing. You can also pick this up at any of your garden centers, and you can use the same cutter to cut these to length. And the reason I like this so much is because I prefer to be able to have some flexibility in where plants go. And if you have a length of this coming out of your poly tube, you can move it to any plant or any area around the base of the plant that you might want. You can also wrap it through plants to get to the far edges of your system where not enough water might be. So, very simple. I'm going to walk through a few fittings that you would need to know here. The first is this coupling that allows you to attach your vinyl tubing to your poly tubing. Again, same tool, just a punch, make a 1/4 inch hole, right on down like this. And we take this coupling. I'm going to do something that's a little bit disgusting, but it sure makes life easier. And that's I just suck on the end of this fitting a little bit to get it moist so that it slides right on into this vinyl tube, like so. And I'm going to insert the other end of that coupling right down into my poly tube. And there you go. When pressure builds up along this line, water is going to come right through this tube. Now, we have lots and lots of options for the end of this, right? But I'd like to show you one more thing. Just like we want our main valve on our poly line so we have some granular control over watering, I always like to give myself some control over the watering that happens at the end of these vinyl tubes, right? Because there might be a plant out there that I end up overwatering by accident and I need to dial it back. Or I may not always have a plant at the end of this vinyl tubing and I'd like it to stop watering altogether. So I'm just going to snip this vinyl tube in half, again using my handy poly cutter tool. And I'm going to introduce you to this fitting. This fitting is just a small 1/4 inch valve for this vinyl line. The twist of this dial will either turn off the water or turn it on. All right, so let's put that dial into the system here. And just like that, we can control the water flow through this vinyl tube. Now, just put a dripper on the end of this, direct it right at the base of the plant. And finally, the last option I want to show you are these stand sprinklers, right? They already come with a fitting to go into your poly line. and they have a stake with a sprinkler head on the top here. And that sprinkler head's going to spray out just like you would expect a sprinkler head to do on a certain pattern across the surface. Now, one of the advantages of drip irrigation is you can put it under your mulch and it's going to water in a way that doesn't waste a lot. The winds don't blow it away. It doesn't all stay up on the surface and get evaporated. But sometimes I like to put a sprinkler on my line to make sure that I'm getting a nice even moistness on the surface of the soil, and I'm doing it more regularly such that it doesn't dry out over the course of the day. Same procedure. We take our punch, in we go, and we take that fitting from the stake sprinkler and just pop it directly into the poly line. And now you've got yourself a stake sprinkler connected to your main water line. Now, one of the things I love about this is that I can deliver water exactly where I want it, and I have the flexibility of these flexible lines so I can place it. But beds change over time, don't they? So I'm going to introduce you to one last fitting in the event that you find that you've got to modify this. Let's say, okay, well, spring's now over. I no longer need that stake sprinkler, so I'm going to remove it. If you had a valve on it, you could just turn off that line, but another option is what they call a goof plug. And this goof plug is just a terminator that allows you to go right in that hole that you had already punched, pop this in, and keep water from spurting out. You'll probably still get a little leakage around there depending on how worn the hole is, but for the most part it'll plug that up so that water doesn't come streaming out of your system and you can keep good pressure there. And that's about it. So let's go upstairs and design our beds, and then we'll assemble our irrigation system. So let's draw out a quick diagram of the bed. Very simply, we know that it is about 3 foot deep. It's about 5.5 foot wide on the interior of this bed. We've got a main water line stretching along the back to supply water to all of my beds, and we've got a T-fitting here on that main water line. Well, the first thing we want to do, as we've discussed, is to get a valve on this bed so that we can turn the water on and off specifically for this particular bed. Coming out of that inline valve, we'll have another piece of poly tube that, if I look at the way this bed's organized with a row of tomatoes and a row of peppers, I think the best thing to do here is to add a T-fitting so that we can run one long poly dripper right out here in front of the tomatoes. We'll put an end cap on it here. Extend down with an elbow. And run another long line back here behind the peppers and cap it off. And I think that should be enough for us to supply water to all the plants in this bed by adding drippers at 9 to 12 inch increments along the poly tube. Now, I just happen to know, because I took inventory earlier, that we only have so many elbows. And unfortunately, I don't have enough elbows to do a closed system, but certainly one option would be, if you can imagine, let me just draw a line here, we could certainly put in an elbow here, some poly here, connect them up, and we would have a complete closed system. That's actually the way I'd prefer to do it. But because of the limitations I have with what fittings I have on hand, I'm going to go with this approach instead. Couple of quick tips. The corners of these beds tend to get neglected in the irrigation system designs. That's not a good thing because the soil here comes in contact with so much of the border of the bed that these corners do dry out more quickly. Now, one easy option could be running our polytube drippers closer to the edges. But the problem I found with that is that the water, seeking the path of least resistance, tends to run down the crack between the soil and the bed itself, and I lose a whole lot of moisture that way. So what I prefer to do is run my drip in the center of the bed, expecting it to spread as far out to the edges as possible. And if I find that I have a dry spot, well, then I'll go back in and attach those vinyl lines that we talked about to make sure I get enough water to those plants. All right, we're back out here in the garden, so let's get started by hooking up our main line here. Again, simple to get in, and even simpler, of course, if I hadn't have had to do this after the fact. But you just press it into this T-coupling, like this, pressure fit it, and tighten the collar. And you can see now, we have connected our main line to this bed through the inline valve and down the length of our bed to this elbow. Put this elbow right through here and we are in business. Now I'm going to go ahead and stake the end of this to make sure it stays exactly where I want it to. Now I'm going to attach those two arms, one behind the peppers, one behind the tomatoes. One quick tip as well is that when you lay these out in the bed, they're going to be a little bit challenging because they have memory of being in that coil. So if you'll lay them down in your beds, basically against the curve, so opposite to the way that they bend, and then stake them on one end, they'll lay down a lot flatter. One more back behind the tomatoes here. It's going to be the trickiest one because it's back behind everything. And we're going to reach back here and connect it. I apologize that this is a little bit hard to see, but that is the nature of it since I'm having to retrofit this into a bed that's already been planted. And now you can see two poly tubes running the length of those rows. All right, great. Now all we've got to do is go and install our drippers right where we need them. Take that tool, and in we go with the dripper. And just like that. All right, now I've put drippers along both rows of poly tube at about 9 to 12 inch separation. Make sure that we get this ground good and saturated. And then I've found that I did have an oversight in my planting. I mentioned to you that the corners are sometimes neglected. Well, you can see here pretty clearly that my nearest dripper to this pepper plant is way back here. It's reasonably okay for this tomato plant, but I just don't think it's going to be sufficient for this pepper plant. So we are going to use, as we discussed previously, a little bit of vinyl tubing to supply water right directly to the base of this pepper plant. Let's do it. Let's find a good place to attach this to the poly line. Again, we've discussed this, but it's just going to be a piece of vinyl tubing split in half, 1/4 inch coupling on one side, a valve in the middle so I can control that water flow, and a dripper on one end. So we're going to go right in here with the hole punch, in with the coupling, and we're just going to lay that right there at the base of this pepper plant to make sure it gets all the water it requires.
Here you can see my outdoor faucet. Obviously, for the irrigation system to have access to water when it needs it, this is going to have to be on all the time. So we want to make sure all of these fittings are watertight, using rubber washers wherever possible to ensure that. Now, I've got a Y splitter here coming off of this faucet, one line running down to the irrigation system and the other one running up here to my garden hose so I can have access to water on demand when I need it. Now, we'll cover the settings for this timer at the end of the video, but for now, let's walk through the construction of the system. So this timer has a valve to turn the water on or off before running straight into this pressure regulator to keep our line at a steady 25 psi, and then into the drip filter to catch any sediment before it enters our main irrigation poly line at the T here, ultimately bound for our raised beds. Now what I've done is I've run this poly tubing from my water supply here down and into the ground. Then I dug a small trench where I placed the poly tube and covered it back up. So it's running underground here so that I can sod over it in the near future. And it comes out behind my beds, where I have a T-joint to distribute some to my flower beds on the left and the rest to my raised beds on the right. All right, now let's take a look at this timer. Now, watering strategy probably warrants a whole nother small video. But let's talk about the basic controls of these timers. There's going to be a lot of different manufacturers, but they all operate basically the same, right? You want to go in here first and set the clock. It's got to know what time of day it is wherever you are. It's not smart enough to figure that out on its own. You can see it's 4:17 p.m. here. Next up, you need to tell it, if it's 4:17 now, what time do you want it to start watering? Well, you can see I've got mine set for 6 a.m. I want to start watering before it gets too hot. And then I set the duration. I want to water for 5 minutes. Now again, I'll ramp up that duration as the days get hotter. Then I need to let it know what days of the week to water. Well, I water every day of the week. One recommendation I would have is that you look for one of these timers that allows you to set for every 6 or 12 hours so you can water multiple times a day. Then you're going to set this thing to auto, which means now it knows what time of day to water, it knows what time it is now, and it knows how long to do it. And that program is set so you can keep your beds nice and moist even when you're not home.